last talk for this evening and for today. It's Guido, are you serious for running Debian on your smartphone? So Guido, it's your stage.
Thank you very much, Philip. Welcome everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about Debian on mobile devices, especially smartphones, and what happened there recently, and if it's actually feasible to do so. This is like a premiere for me. This is like the very first time I run the talk itself from the phone, so several things might go wrong and I might have to pick up the laptop in between, but let's try that thing. As a short introduction, I'm a Debian developer since some time. I've worked with libvirt a little bit, with Git build package. By day job, I'm a freelancing free software developer, and I'm working with Purism on the Librem 5 phone. So to make this very short, am I serious about Linux on mobile devices and smartphones? Yes, I am, and so I think we can go for beer and talk is done. Or we can alternatively have a look why it might be worth running Debian on these kind of devices. And with lots of things, like when we run it on servers and workstations, we take many things for granted, like software freedom. We only run free software on these devices. We know where our data goes, so we don't like it when anything phones out or tracks us. We want proper security updates, and we basically want to be in control rather than having the vendor of the device being in control. And these are all things we take very much for granted on everything else, but not on the phones we carry in our pocket all the time. So I think there's actually a strong point for trying to run free operating systems on smartphones. And the whole thing started like a while back. Who recognizes these two? Okay, what is the top one? Yeah, that's the free runner, and the one below that. Yeah, and 900 from Nokia. So both of them were running Linux. Both of them were basically running a Linux distribution as we know them. The N900 was even running something Debian-based. Not everything in there was free software, but I think it was pretty close to what we would kind of think it could look like. Unfortunately, at some point, Nokia got bought by Microsoft, and from there, all of this pretty much went downhill. To look at a little bit at the not so distant past, everything went Android from there on, and we basically saw lots of devices running Android with very locked down bootloaders, so you couldn't even easily replace the operating system, with lack of hardware specifications, so there was no public available documentation about the SoC. Everything had to be reverse engineered, and there were proprietary user space bits, and very importantly, one of these proprietary user space bits usually is the GPU driver, and without the GPU driver you don't have graphics, and this makes a phone pretty much useless nowadays. So reverse engineering efforts started in that area. One of the earlier ones was the Etnaviv project, which reverse engineered the Vivante GPUs. There's also Panfrost and other ones, which made great progress recently. So we are kind of half replacement for these GPU bits. But also those devices usually run something that only very far resembles a mainline Linux kernel. So it's an Android kernel to start with, so you don't usually run a GNU userland on it by Bionic libc, so that's totally different. And usually vendors also even patch these heavily patched Android kernels even further to make them suitable for their devices. And it's all pretty much a mess because you don't have specifications, so you can't just mainline the drivers, and you can't kind of get this all to a mainline kernel, which would build a base for running a free operating system on top of that. Fortunately, and other projects that kind of tried to do something else, like Mozilla with their mobile operating system and others, always used these kind of Android kernels, and this usually didn't go that well. Many of these things don't exist anymore, or are repurposed nowadays for something else. I get to that in a minute. Wrong direction. And about 2 years ago, suddenly a new class of devices reappeared on the market, similar to the N900. There were some Linux first devices that basically run a mainline Linux kernel to very well-known ones are the Librem 5 from Purism and the Pinephone from Pine64. The Librem 5 uses an IMX8 SoC as the main chip, while the Pinephone uses an all-winner one. I have a photo of the Librem 5 up there. Those are meant to run Linux. And while this sounds very simple, it actually was quite a bit of work to get this going. So you had to write, like, initial support for the SoC was done by other people, but we had to write lots of device drivers and get the device tree into place and all these kind of things. But now devices are very, very close to running mainline Linux, and this could build a very well base for running Debian. Also, interesting to note is that for some Android devices, I think the more prominent ones are the OnePlus 6 and 6T and the Pocophone F1, which you can buy. They're not extremely recent, but they're still easy to get. Those are complete reverse engineering efforts, and they run a mainline kernel nowadays, and they also form a very good base for running Debian on them. Just like maybe one word of caution, now that we're seeing more devices running like mainline Linux again, vendors like just out of a sudden start to advertise their devices like Linux devices, but if you look closer, they still run Android kernels and they run Halium in between, and then they put a GNU user space on top. Those devices are not very likely to see good Debian support in the future. So if you get a device, either stick to those or have a close look at the Debian wikis or the postmarket.os wikis for device recommendations. Or do the porting work. That's the other thing. So now we have like the phone, we have like a kernel that does all the necessary bits. We said many of the GPU drivers are working nowadays. Now we just need a user space. How hard can that be? It turns out not that simple. So there have been multiple efforts in the past. One which is probably well known is Lumiri, which came out of Ubuntu Touch, which was started way back then by Canonical when they wanted to build a mobile phone. This one is still around. It uses the Mir display server. Then there's a GNOME-based one, which uses a shell called Fosh, which I talk a little bit more about on the next slide. Then there's Plasma Mobile, which is based on KDE components. And there's a relatively recent one, which is SXMO, which tries to be very simple and configurable and minimalistic, which is probably the most geeky one, but it also looks very interesting. And like to talk a little bit more about the GNOME one, that's basically if you compare it to your desktop, it really runs basically your desktop GNOME session. So there's GNOME settings daemon in there. You use your regular GNOME control center. The file manager is the same. All these kind of things. What is different is that the GNOME shell is replaced by another shell, which is based on GTK3 and which has compositor, the Wayland compositor and the shell and the on-screen keyboard separated, which we call that Fosh, which is like purposed for small screen sizes and compared to modern laptops, devices that don't have that much RAM and are not so CPU capable. But the GNOME applications, that's maybe the important point, are really the same. So the approach of the GNOME project is not to kind of like do two sets of applications, once for your desktop, once for your mobile phone, but have like one application, and when you kind of like have it on a large screen, it uses all the screen space, and when you have it on a small screen, it basically shrinks and uses less space. There's like gesture support in there for swiping. I would do a demo, but I won't be able to do that with a virtual mouse, so kind of like we can do that maybe after the talk if somebody's interested. This is powered by a library that is called Lipendi, which is aimed at making GNOME applications adaptable, and more applications are catching up there and basically fit onto small screen sizes. And I think that's actually a very interesting approach, because for one, you basically only need to know one operating system and one user interface, and for the other, you save lots of duplication work. It's also not trivial, because there's lots of details to look at, but I think this is actually making very, very good progress. Okay, so from the like feature-wise set, what are we able to do now with these kind of like software stacks? So for the GNOME-based stack, at least I can say it does phone calls, it does mobile data, the sensors like rotation sensor and proximity sensor and this kind of stuff that works. You have a torch. Camera support is there, but that is kind of like it's basic. So it can do pictures, but all this what you're used to on modern phones, kind of like you pull it out of the pocket, do a picture, put it back. That still needs some user space work because many of the things that are automatic nowadays in the proprietary software world need still to be implemented with free drivers and free user space software like automatic exposure, white balance, and these kind of things. But this made like great progress during the last couple of months, so I think that won't be too far off. We have lots of touch-friendly apps, so most of the core GNOME apps actually fit quite nicely. There are some exceptions, but that's becoming more and more usable, and the app list actually grows way quicker than I would have expected. It's also growing way quicker than the team that currently looks at these kind of things can actually handle. And as a very, very last resort, so if there's kind of like the one Android app for your bank or whatever you can't do without with, then there's emulation, which is like Nbox, which is an emulator for Android, and there's a newer one which is called Waydroid. Nbox is packaged in Debian. So what is the current state within Debian with these things? So we have for the GNOME base, for the Phosh stack, we have most of the stuff in. That's not the case for Bullseye. There's some bits missing, but for Bookworm, we have everything in place. Many of the GNOME core applications, as I said before, are adaptive in GNOME 40, which already is in testing. It will even improve further with GNOME 41, so that's also going to the right direction. Many adaptive applications are in Debian already that aren't part of core GNOME, like Toodle, which is the Mastodon client, Lollipop, which is a music player, and more stuff. We have like the device-specific tweaks already there, so there's kind of like packages that bring in the power, special power tweaks for the Librem 5 or for the Pine phone, so you basically kind of like can optimize a little bit for battery usage or to tweak some of the GNOME settings. And we have the meta packages already there that basically pulls in the whole stack if you want to. What are the to-dos? So from the kind of like more from the outside of Debian, there's still some patches within GNOME that are kind of like used in projects that make things adaptive, but that aren't kind of like in mainline Nautilus. Work is being done to get these into place, and more prominently, there are some patches on GTK3 itself that you need to make, for example, the file chooser adaptive that isn't in GTK at the moment, but that is being worked on, and that is always being worked on in parallel for both GTK. Like GTK4 usually goes first because this is the newer one, and then GTK3 is being looked at, and this is ongoing work. So what we're also still lacking, I said most of the devices, like we have some devices that are running a mainline kernel that is kind of like true to some extent, but to get like it really working with all like sound panel and these kind of things, most of the devices need some extra patches that still need mainlining. They are usually small and manageable, like not compared to what like Android does with their forks. But we still have to see a device that boots with the kernel that we ship in Debian. That is one of the like the next major steps we want to do, that we kind of like have a kernel that that boots. The Librem 5's dev kit, like not the Librem 5 itself, has basically all the bits in place, so that should work, but that's not that interesting because that has like, it doesn't have a case and you don't want to run around with the PCB at your ear. That looks a little bit silly on the street, but it's geeky. And the same is basically true for U-boot, the bootloader, so they usually need some patches which we need to mainline and get into place there. And once we have that, we can work on installer and flashable images. There are already people from the mobile effort that are working on the installer and making good progress. So I hope that this, like for at least some devices, this will be in place for Bookworm. But what if you kind of like want to grab a device and do it right now? There's kind of like now distributions that carry this delta I was talking about. That isn't in Debian yet. I think the most prominent one likely is Mobian, which targets several devices, and I think it targets all of them that I listed earlier. And then there's PureOS, which specifically targets the Librem 5 for their customers. And if you want to kind of like test it right now, then I'd recommend to go to one of these two first, and then kind of like once we move more stuff into Debian, then kind of like you can go with mainline Debian, so to say. Regarding everyday usability, I know many people that are using these things as on a daily basis and as their only phones. But I think that kind of like very much depends on your use case. So if you're now using 47 different apps for like different messaging platforms, it might be a little bit before you can kind of like actually use it. But it might be kind of like worth to have a look if it maybe already fits your use case. For me, it does. One of the more annoying bits that is missing is like that the GNOME's calendar application isn't like adaptive and doesn't fit on the phone screen perfectly, so it's like quite fiddly to do stuff there. But compared to where we kind of like were several months ago, I think that's kind of like a minor issue kind of like to deal with. And doesn't justify carrying another device. So what if you want to help? The simplest thing is likely kind of like package more applications. There's a list at linmobapps framer.io which basically lists all the applications that run on mobile Linux that you can run on your phone. But we only have like a fraction of that in Debian. So if anybody is interested to getting more stuff in there, then just go ahead. And what we are kind of like also lacking is we don't have all the mobile environments. So we have like the GNOME Foch-based one is pretty complete in Debian. There has been some work on Lumiri, but that isn't complete as far as I know. There has been some work on Plasma Mobile in the past, but we're also missing bits there. And SXMO, I think, isn't even started. So it would be cool if kind of like people that are interested in these areas kind of like start packaging and pushing that stuff to Debian. As a summary, I think it's the Debian on mobile devices is maturing very, very quickly, and I think I hope out of the box support when we release Bookworm is actually doable. So that would actually be cool if you at least would support 1 or 2 devices out of the box. I've gathered some resources, so I will link these slides from the schedule page. I've gathered some resources regarding stuff I've mentioned. So if you want to get involved into packaging for mobile things, there's a Debian on mobile team. I've put the link at the very top. That links to the Matrix, IRC channels, mailing lists, and these kind of things. I've mentioned the Mobian project and PureOS as distributions, some projects I've mentioned. And then if you kind of like want to see some more details, then there's a bunch of talks that talk about these things. I think very interesting is Martin's talk from DebConf 17, where these like Linux first devices weren't around and where kind of like different ways forward were being discussed. Nicole Ferber gave an interesting talk at the CCC camp about the design process of the Librem 5 and what kind of like one has to look at there. Arno, which is the founder of Mobian, gave a talk about Mobian back then and about the principles behind that. And at last year's DebConf, I did a talk where I kind of like put in some numbers, kind of like how large is the delta between the kernel that is currently running on the Librem 5 and like the mainline kernel, and I also have like some more diagrams how the stack looks like in case you're interested. And I think that's it. So if you, oops, sorry. Oh. Oh, I have to go back. There we are. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, go ahead. I think we have time for one question or something.
Yes, we have.
But don't have questions.
Okay, thanks. First, unless it's already on some wiki pages, are there recommendations for devices to buy?
Yes, so I'd recommend the Mobian wiki at the moment because they actually describe the installation process for the devices, and basically these are pretty well supported.
And second question, at least a few years ago there was constant concerns about battery usage.
Yes.
Has that situation improved?
I think it has improved, but I think there's still room for improvement there. So with this thing, I usually get over the day, and now it's off, but maybe I can bring it back. No, the battery is still on, so it's still there. I usually get with it over the day, but what kind of like you want to look at is kind of like you want to like have it like over the day and the night. So it's more like the only early iPhone times where you basically kind of like whenever you have power, you try to charge. That varies a little bit like on use case for one, and also kind of like a little bit on device. Sometimes do a deep suspend, but then kind of like you have problems reacting on certain events. Others kind of like only put as many components to sleep as possible, but I expect kind of like progress there in the next couple of weeks or months, because that's obviously something that bothers people the most.
One more question.
Apart from the calendar application, what would be the one application that you're currently missing in Debian?
In Debian, let's see. I think maybe the next thing is that maps kind of like doesn't fit perfectly. So the maps themselves work, but the routing window doesn't fit precisely. So you kind of like have to rotate the phone, rotate back, and these kind of things. I think that would be the next thing, so I don't get lost.
Thanks.
One more question.
How steep is the learning curve, or to start helping with that? Can I just download some packages, apply some patches, and also what to do if I don't have a device? So can I work on my computer somehow, set screen to small size or something?
Yeah, so there's like so first of all, I think the learning curve is if you look at like applications, like not GPU reverse engineering. If you look at application, I think it's, and at least for me, it was pretty much the same as with other stuff, because it's basically GNOME apps or KDE apps. So if you're kind of like familiar with these, it's very, very similar in packaging, and it makes sense to maintain them in the same teams even. And so I think the learning curve there isn't that hard. And the other thing is kind of like, because these are, I can especially speak about like the GTK ones, because they are very much the same on the laptop and on the device. You can even test things by kind of like just shrinking the window. So if you do that, maybe I can show that off on this device, but then I need HDMI. Does that work if I pull that out? And okay. Just 1 second. Now I have to see if I can get that over there. Yes, there we go. Okay. So if you go to smaller screen size, it basically just gets smaller, and you can go back like this, and if you kind of like use a larger size, it works for all GNOME apps that use this kind of like framework, and so you basically can test the whole thing without using it on a phone. The other thing is you can run the compositors we're using, you can run nested, and then you kind of like put it to the right screen size, and then you can run it in there. That also works. And I think that's one of the like very interesting points about this kind of like of approach, because you basically can use your known development tools to work on these things.
One practical, non-free question in this regard: how well do these emulators actually work? I mean, for your banking app, you mentioned it, but maybe also for the Corona One app or for your transportation provider or whatever.
Good question. I can't answer because I'm not using them actually. So I usually try to find free software solutions, but I know people that are running stuff. So what I know, what I'm told, so kind of like is working well, is if you kind of like, if you use free software Android apps, which there are great ones as well. They usually work pretty well. So if you want to have you don't want to give up on your K9 mail or these kind of things, or OpenStreetMap applications, they should work pretty well. But I kind of like, since I'm not a user, I can't tell much about that.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. That's it for today. Thank you, Guido, for presenting here. This was the last talk for today. We will continue tomorrow at 9 o'clock with MiniDebConf with Luca. So thanks again, have a nice evening, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.